topic, multinational operations and strategic competition, and really it looks at a deep dive on narrative and culture. As Mr. Monroe said, again through the agenda right here, there are a couple concepts I do want to build on throughout to help paint the picture I'm looking at. There's a lot of depth in here that took a lot of work to cut down. So certain things specifically into the analysis and all the research that went behind those pieces. That's not shown so much. If we want to dig into it, we can. The work is there. And I think a piece that would really have a lot of weight is taking a minute and focusing on the conclusions, recommendations, and further research. Particularly for recommendations, I think there's a lot of good applications to this research. And so that's where I would like to take a minute there. So background, I do have two different pieces of background. The reason is I have a background piece that leads into the problem statement, and I have a separate background that leads into SPMAGTF. And the purpose of this study is to really use SPMAGTF as a potential solution to the problem statement. So looking at the background, starting with the SOUTHCOM AOR, it looks at strategic competitors, two of them particularly, the PRC and Russia. And it's looking at their influence activities in the region. So for PRC, the main thing that everyone is familiar with is the One Belt, One Road initiative. For Russia, they spread a lot of disinformation. The challenge with these is that when you look on the top right side with strategic competition, the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. is part of. The U.S. is an American country with all the other Americas in the region. So we look at that, 8 out of 14 countries are aligned with Taiwan. And then we also have 28 out of 31 countries are similar democracies in the region. So the concept that I'll build throughout, that I really help visualize and frame the study is the system and the bottom line. So I start off and I call it a U.S. strategic competition system. The idea is that you have U.S. and Latin American and Caribbean alignment on the left side in the blue, and then PRC and Russia's alignment with Latin America and the Caribbean on the right. As our alignment with them increases relative to Russia, their alignment decreases, and vice versa. So I'm looking at right here, this is looking at it at a national level, and that's why I have DIME written in there for diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And we're going to focus it and narrow it down as we go through. So problem statement, PRC and Russia has significantly increased their influence in Latin America and the Caribbean in ways that jeopardize U.S. influence and threaten democratic governance. Looking specifically at SPMAGTF, I need to start with SOUTHCOM. So this is digging a little further into literature review. But the reason I need to hit here is because I'm looking at SOUTHCOM's ends, ways, and means. SOUTHCOM's ends are shared values, great opportunities, stronger security partnerships. The ways are strengthened partnerships and counter threats, and the means are military engagements. The reason I'm front-loading this right here is because that's a lot of the verbiage and the activities that I'm looking at in this study, specifically military engagements. If you look at the system that I had on the right, I'm blowing up the U.S. side, and what I'm looking at is specifically the SOUTHCOM inside the U.S.'s diplomatic, information, military, and economic activities, and how it influences the relationship specifically through the military activities. And that's where you see the ends, ways, and means nested within U.S. national elements of power right there. And then getting down to SPMAGTF SOUTHCOM, the focus of the study is looking at SPMAGTF SOUTHCOM, particularly 2015 to 17 against 2018 and 2019. 2015 to 2017 was U.S. only. 2018 and 2019 were multinational. So same thing on the diagram on the right. I'm putting up there in SPMAGTF 15 through 17 in the beige bubbles. Those are their military engagements. You see 14, 12, and 14 per MAGTF, relatively steady. And then you see all the engagements on the left. Now the next slide is going to be multinational operations. So compare this with this right here. The activities increase the range, the quantity, and what I will argue in the paper is the value. So you have the same beige bubbles right there. U.S. only 15 to 17 were about 12 to 14. 18 and 19 increased to 25 and then 54. And then the IP&O bubbles you see are integrated partner nation officers. And so that is, my paper is researching if there is a cause from the integrating partner nation officers to increase the military engagements. And then that gets us to the purpose of the study. Essentially, the purpose of the study was SPMAGTF 18 and 19 as a multinational task force a potential solution to the problem statement. Research questions. Primary research question is looking at the purpose of the study. Was SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 18 and 19 a solution? The first secondary research question focuses specifically onto the partner nation officers integrated and if there were effects in strengthening partnerships. The second research question, secondary research question, looks at further literature on it, specifically narrative, communication strategies, and culture. The third research question is looking at what advantages and disadvantages are there through narrative communication strategy and culture. Then you see the hypothesis on their line specifically just to the first secondary research question. The reason is that first one is quantitative in nature, the second and the third are qualitative. Literature review. So, relatively brief. I do have a couple more slides, and that's because as I go through the literature review, that system we looked at gets focused a little more too. So the first secondary research question looks at joint doctrine, national level strategies, and then also US SOUTHCOM strategies. And that was already hit a little bit in the background. The second and third research questions are broken out into two subjects, narrative and culture. And those two subjects will also mirror the two research subjects for the second and third research subjects that we hit in the methodology. So starting with narrative, Dr. Steed, I do have you on here. I did like your narrative positional advantages, so I do use some of that verbiage in the thesis. But the primary ones I looked at were Matthew Slater. He looks at strategic narratives, and he had different levels or layers of narratives. Ajit Maan, I used her definition of narrative, and narrative consists of meaning, identity, content, and structure. Through these two ideas in a literature study, literature review, that's where I started recognizing an idea called a shared regional narrative. So the shared regional narrative is not something I found in literature. It's something where I put pieces together and I thought this made sense. And I think this partly can explain why SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 18 and 19 started to have more effects. The basic idea is that SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 15 to 17 as a U.S.-only task force, they were doing a lot of the same activities. They were strengthening partnerships in the region. But it was the U.S. in the region strengthening regional partnerships. In 18 and 19, when we created a multinational task force, it's now no longer a U.S.-only narrative. It is now a multinational narrative. When that Colombian is on task force, when that Belizean, when that Brazilian, and so forth, Argentinian, Chilean, it is now their narrative too with it. And so that's where I started looking at concepts that we know through a lot of other literature that communicating a narrative, communicating messages through the other audiences gives it a lot more strength, and I think that's probably what happened. So that's where I look at the concept of shared regional narrative, and then that's where, over here on this diagram, you start to see this little bubble right here. And then literature review on culture. Thankfully for culture, I wasn't creating a new concept, so it was a little more straightforward. But particularly, I looked at Jörg Hofstede, and he had 6 cultural dimensions. And to help scope the study, I focused specifically on power distance and individualism and collectivism. So same thing, we had the system we looked at before. Now in addition to shared regional narrative, we also have the shared regional culture, really with all actors, not just US specific. And one of the things I look at in the study is the advantages and disadvantages for each. The US has some, and Russia and China have some of their own advantages too. Methodology, I'll run through it relatively quickly, but basically the first piece is selection criteria. Essentially, we're looking at all the iterations of SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM. I crossed out SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 20 because due to COVID, they did not deploy downrange, and they did not have good results for not deploying downrange to test the hypothesis that we were looking at. Data collection and case study analysis variables. So when I talk about military engagement, so number one, case study analysis variables, right here, you have 1 through 7. These are all the activities that SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM did, and all of them nest under SOUTHCOM's strategic guidance of either countering threats or strengthening partnerships. And then the additional 2 pieces are KLD trip reports, and then theories on narrative and culture. These over here are the 3 different research subjects I had. So you see the first one lines up pretty clearly. First research question, first research subject, and the hypothesis. The second and third research question are broken into the narrative and culture pieces of the research. As we looked at before, the secondary research question asked, how does narrative and culture impact SPMAGTF? And then the third were, what were the advantages and disadvantages? So that's how it was broken out, and I have the narrative piece of it, and then the culture piece of it. The first research subject is quantitative. The second and third research subjects are qualitative. So I will take a second and I'll talk about the quantitative piece of the first research subject. What I looked at doing, I looked at how many different integrated partner officers we had into each of the SPMAGTFs, 15 through 19. From there, that gave a baseline of how many military engagements we had correlated to how many integrated partner officers. After I had that established, I'm then looking at what other influences could have affected the increased military engagements per SPMAGTF. It looks like it is mostly from the multinational personnel integrated, but until I roll out all other pieces, I cannot isolate that piece of it. So looking at finance, looking at duration, and then also the increase of the U.S. staff. For all those 3 pieces, which I think would be the main contributors to it, there were no change throughout any of the SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOMs. After I eliminated any possible other influences to increase the military engagements, I looked at weighting the military engagements. So I did a numbers of 1 through 4. And I started off what I thought would be the most impactful, and that's going to be security cooperation training teams. They're the first in the region, and they're the longest lasting 6 months, working with a persistent presence with partners in the region. So I gave that a 4. And I went through the different criteria of all the variables of training teams, mobile training teams, U.S. Colombian action, events, exercises, etc. For example, exercises, less duration, more people, still a little lower value though. Mobile training teams, 1 month in duration, but you have a new team every time, so they can hit 6 different teams, and there's going to be a lower value, but they can do a larger quantity of it. So that's where I started to identify what the weights are for each of these. And then upon completion of weighting that, that's where I looked at all the different methods of study or methods of analysis that I did for each subject. The first one is going to be the most in-depth, being quantitative, but the first one did look at SPMAGTF as a whole in the region with integrated partner nation officers. It looked at it specifically by partner nations, and then it also looked at by the quantity of partner nations, and the last piece is the KLDs. So with that first piece being more quantitative, that last one, KLD trip reports, is where it starts to hit a little bit of the qualitative piece to it.
Next question for clarification, shared regional culture, that's qualitative or quantitative?
That's qualitative, that's a typo
okay,
right
just
there.
type, okay, just thank you.
So this is about the depth of the analysis I will look at, and really this is just highlighting the data that I did collect. So all the top pieces are all the variables that we already discussed, and this specifically is looking at SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 19. So I did this by SPMAGTF, and I did it for a couple other ways I did analyze the data, but the very raw data that I pulled was looking at each country and how many in each SPMAGTF of these military engagements do they do. This next piece, KLE trip reports, this is where the first research subject looks at a little bit of a qualitative piece to it. This is all the KLE trip reports, or all the KLEs that the commander of SPMAGTF-SC conducted. I went with him. It was a 4-person team, myself, the commander of SPMAGTF, the Colombian deputy commander for the MAGTF, and our sergeant major. What qualified as a KLE was any engagement with senior military leadership. So I'm looking at joint staff or host countries, Marine Corps staff and higher, but nothing lower than, say, a commandant of their Marine Corps or their G3 of their Marine Corps. What I have highlighted in green and not highlighted is this is just a pool of some of the activities that we saw from each country. So any of the activities that we saw that they expressed interest is a little bit of a qualifier right there. They're at least expressing interest to strengthen partnerships and work with us. The highlighted green pieces are the things that they expressed interest in doing with us and then actually executed in the duration of our deployment. So even the things that aren't highlighted green, there was still a lot of potential for them to execute, but flash to bang of something within the same duration of deployment is relatively tough, yet we still executed a lot of it. And then this teases out a couple of the findings. I'll let you read it, but what I ended up doing is for each of the methods of research that I went through, I identified all the results per each of those methods, and then I started to categorize and compile all the results. And so that's where you see, for example, this one right here, that came from results 1A3 and 1A4. Then after compiling them, I pulled those results into what all came to a finding. So we see that all these different results pulled into this finding right here. So with quite a few different methods of analysis, there was a lot of redundancy in results. But this is where the weeding out the methods, come the results, pull the results, and then pulling all the results together into the main findings at the conclusion of the paper. I think for integrating partner nation officers and strengthening partnerships, one of the key findings that I found here, I mean, yes, it tested the hypothesis and it provided evidence that strengthening partnerships or integrating partner nation officers strengthen partnerships. One of the things that was really key, though, is, for example, in SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 18, even though Colombia was the only country that integrated a partner nation officer, SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM 18 still had increased partnerships with a lot of the other countries. So I expected there to be a really clear correlation between integrated partner nation officers and that specific country to increase partnerships. But that piece right there shows that SPMAGTF becoming a multinational task force still increased it with the other countries too in the region. Shared regional narrative. The one piece I did pull out, I talked to a little bit that I got from you, Dr. Steve. I think it just makes a really good case to say how legitimacy and will were increased in these operations. The second piece, looking at number 3 right there, is looking at Jeet Man's meeting identity content. So she had meeting identity content and structure. Not really a big change in structure, but the meaning of the narrative was not increased, it was strengthened because we had partner nation officers on the staff to help develop a more accurate narrative. The identity changed because no longer is it just U.S. personnel pushed in this narrative, but now we have Colombians and partner nation officers to add to identity, have truth and fidelity up there too, and transparency is a big piece throughout. I have other pieces with messenger, audience, and so forth. There's a lot more detail on them. And then, of course, the last piece, the content change, because SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM is now a multinational task force, not U.S. only. And then the last bullet point, which I teased out a little bit in the paper, is the concept that I'm growing with the shared regional narrative. And that's the shared regional narrative requires mutual contribution and ownership of the narrative and recognition of all participants as peers. that's where I start to identify it as an asymmetric advantage, because ceding that mutual contribution and ownership of a narrative when you're an authoritarian regime is not feasible. It's antithesis to be an authoritarian regime. And then one last piece, I might get in the next slide, I don't need to talk about it now. Cultural dimensions, the last research subject. So this looks at Hofstede. I mainly broke it down into two main pieces. The first is, it is a little more of a quantitative on the first piece, but it's just looking across the cultural dimensions. Where does the US sit? Where does Russia? Where does China sit? As we found, to the dimensions, US sits closest. To the dimensions, Russia. To the dimensions, the PRC. This first one is looking at the idea that if the US is closer aligned across all cultural dimensions with Latin American and Caribbean, it will increase cross-cultural communication and give them an advantage in the region. As we see though, only 2 of the 6. But in the bottom left, what I did look at also, in addition to 2 of the 6, the average difference across all dimensions, the US is closest. So the US is only 24 away from all countries in Latin America and Caribbean. Russia's 31 and China's 31. And then looking a little further at the qualitative piece of this in Hofstede, he does communicate in his research how closer alignment to cultural dimensions, which is a nation's values, does facilitate cross-cultural communication. And then the second piece is looking at more specific, looking at the cultural dimensions. So this is what advantages and disadvantages are there across cultural dimensions that don't match with lining up. So if I look at this right here, China is the closest aligned to Latin American and Caribbean in power distance and individualism. So in the one sense of cross-cultural communication, they will be closer. And the US is last in that one. But that's why I looked at power distance and individualism and collectivism a little more closely. Power distance, generally a country with a very high power distance has challenges with establishing multinational organizations. Looking at individual and collectivism, it has to do with exclusionism and universalism. And that has a lot to do with trust. So the difference with individualism and collectivism, it's not only the country's perspective. So for example, if say Latin American and Caribbean is 50, it's going to matter what their number is with the PRC and Russia or with the US. So even though they're closer aligned to Russia and the PRC, that doesn't necessarily give them an advantage. The US being all the way towards the bottom, a lot further from them, gives them the advantage that the US only has to overcome Latin American Caribbean's exclusionism. We'll call it a trust threshold, versus the PRC and Russia being high on those dimensions. They have their own high trust threshold and then Latin American Caribbean's thresholds. So I use that as an example of where I found that as a surprising find, that even though PRC and Latin America in these dimensions are closer, we still have the advantage being a lot further down and further away from them. They still have an advantage in certain aspects of cross-cultural communication, but there's other pieces too that we get advantages to also. So a little complicated. Thankfully, I have a lot more text in the paper to extrapolate there. And then for language, simply on the outer layer, it is a symbol piece of culture, and PRC and Russia don't even have the same alphabet. So there's a lot more barriers that they have to overcome there, that we have an advantage of being English, but then also having Spanish being the second most prominent language in the US. So, in conclusion, yes, primary research question was answered. Integrating partner nation officers into SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM. There's strong evidence to say that it was a cause for increasing the military engagements. That's it under SOUTHCOM strategy. Increasing military engagements is how they strengthen partnerships, and within their strategy, how they strengthen partnerships is how SOUTHCOM competes with the PRC in Russia. The second piece, shared regional narrative and culture do provide an explanation on why integrating partner nation officers increase the military engagements. They aren't the entire answer, but they do provide part of the explainability behind it. And then the third piece is there are advantages. As we saw, shared regional culture, shared regional narrative, the concept behind it has inherent challenges with an authoritarian regime. And then the other piece is that we saw the culture, there are some asymmetric advantages and disadvantages. I only talked mostly about the advantages right there, but the paper does have both. So going in the recommendations, but one key finding that I thought was in there that I didn't see is the shared regional concept. A strength I saw behind it is when you develop a shared regional narrative, you are also integrating that partner nation. If he owns that narrative, he is now having a say in that narrative. So the strength behind that is you now have these multinational task forces, multinational personnel at, say, SOUTHCOM, that are developing the narrative and, in a sense, the mission that SPMAGTF-SCOM is, and it is helping, providing a forcing function to identify U.S. blind spots. It is no longer us just creating our narrative and mirror imaging and saying what SOUTHCOM is going to think and how our narrative is going to work. We now have partner nation officers coming, developing it with us, telling us how it's going to work. And if we don't listen to them, that is a great forcing function that they can say, hey, I don't agree, this doesn't make sense, I'm not joining. So it provides a little additional forcing function for U.S. blind spots where it's very easy to mirror image and miss that. So this piece right here, recommendations and implementation. Recommendation, this research is an example for how we leverage inherent informational aspects. I had the verbiage for my title very specifically, inherent informational aspects, because that's the verbiage in the new JP 304, Information and Joint Operations. The biggest difference with that is information is a joint function. And with information being a joint function, we no longer conduct information operations. We conduct operations in an information environment, and we leverage inherent informational aspects of all military operations. So a multinational task force is not an information operation or an OIE per se in the same sense as MISO or civil affairs or cyber or any other information pieces, but it's getting at the idea that everything has informational aspects to it that is applicable to the whole force. So I think this is a case study where when you first tell people that this is applicable to everyone, okay, that makes sense, but show me, tell me. And I think this research here shows how SPMAGTF-SCOM helps demonstrate that. Same thing, it's a good example of strategic competition. And culture and narrative. Hofstede's cultural dimensions, it gives a very easy tool for that too. When you see a lot of cultures, or when you see a lot of U.S. forces not understand culture or trying to get through that barrier, Hofstede's culture dimensions, it's a website. I put it in the paper, I say, look at this if you're doing anything related to cultures. Put it in your nation, put it in the other nations, it gives you the values very simply. That's the very baseline bottom level, but it opens the door for everyone in the entire force to start understanding the culture of the partner nations that they're working with. Operationalize multinational operations. That right there is saying that SPMAGTF-SOUTHCOM serves as a model on how we could conduct strategic competition. We could use SPMAGTF again. We could bring the model to JTF Bravo rather than creating a second force. We could implement some of these findings into Marine littoral regiments, force design updates, etc. The idea behind it, though, is that there's a lot of strengths that come with making a multinational task force, but specifically in the headquarters. When you put in the headquarters, in the ops shop, and all the other sections, that's where you start to really get a better understanding of where you can leverage them the best. Number 3, codify multi operations as a tool for information. This is relatively basic and simple, but the surprise to me is when I read JP 3-16, multinational operations, it only talks about multinational task force and multinational operations in the sense of using them as a conventional force. There's a lot of other implications that they could be used for, which is what I studied here. So identify it and use it. And then JP 304 puts all this feedback on how they conduct OIE. So add to it. Hey, this is an OIE, but this is a piece on how we get after IIA. Maybe start identifying all the different ways we could do IIA in conjunction with the OIE. Better understand leverage culture. A blatant finding is we don't incorporate culture in a lot of military operations and how we do things. On the one index, Latin American Caribbean was low, it was high on collectivism, low on individualism, making it a little harder or longer for them to trust personnel and work with them. But when we look at foreign affairs officers that go to embassies, we're going to send them on the same 1.5 to 2-year tour to Latin America and the Caribbean than we would to Europe, where someone working with England, they're going to trust them, other personnel within, say, a month versus it taking like maybe a year in Latin America and the Caribbean. So a lot of other things across the entire force and operations of the military that are blind to that. I find it a little shocking that something with the purpose of building relationships does not incorporate how to build relationships, culture that is. And then lastly, number 5, integrate partner nation officers, liaison officers into planning of operations, activities, and investments. And that one right there is getting after what I talked about, and them helping us address our blind spots. So I have that up there, strengthen transparency. That's how we strengthen partnerships and how we really combat a lot of the disinformation and the predatory, opaque economic policies by the PRC. Transparency. Working with them is only going to help open up the transparency, and they will help us identify where we're weak and strengthen us in those areas too. Implementation. So I did put a little thought in this, and the reason so is I think there's a lot of value in what is here, and if I don't implement it, if I also don't write it well and distribute the thesis and talk to people, it's kind of a lost cause that I put on my shelf and I love forever. But really, I think there's a lot of value throughout. The first piece is, I didn't discuss this in detail. We did discuss about publication opportunities. I want to actually write a good thesis first before I discuss that. But one of the things I'm looking at is, I think the interagency journal has a lot of application for this, particularly because this has a lot of value for the interagency community. So I think that's why it would be more applicable to the interagency journal. They publish and they push their journal to every embassy out there. Communicate the findings. So throughout the research, I did work with some friends that I've had experience with, Marine Forces South, Marine Forces Reserve. I'm currently on good relationships with the SDODAT in Colombia. I know the Naval Attaché in Ecuador, who's worked with this deployment too. So it's really communicating with them where I see strengths, and informally them taking it and talking to their bosses saying, this is why this works, this is why we could do this. But then also really communicating findings, especially to the partner nation, the U.S. embassies. There is a challenge, which we particularly saw yesterday at STRATCOM, with the interagency or Department of State communicating with the U.S. military. This right here is a great case study saying, hey, U.S. Embassy, this military activity in your country can help. You don't have to fight with us. We are doing activities that have effects in the information environment, that have effects in your diplomatic relations. If you understand us better, which this could communicate, then we can work with you and get more authority to do what we're trying to do to help really better both of us for that whole government approach. this is just an idea, number 3. I've yet to really tease this out a little bit, but it's looking at, I know we do have a thing coming at the end on how we present our panel, but one thing I would like, I mean, Hugo, I really appreciate you coming here. I have a personal interest in this. I still have relations with all the partner nation officers that I worked with. I would be more than happy to communicate this and maybe give another presentation to the multinational person here at CGSC. If anything, communicate my standpoint on it, and then also get their feedback if they agree, disagree, or areas to improve. And then number 4, so I am going down to Buenos Aires for the World Congress of Political Science Association, so I'll be briefing down there. It's not going to be this per se, I will tailor a little bit, but it's just continuing to grow on the research and finding a little bit more of the civilian side of this research and the political science community. Further research, I'm not going to go into detail here unless you don't want me to. There's a lot of further research we can do. I limit myself in areas. And then I will leave you with this quote here by Brigadier General Salim, and this is him talking about conclusion of doing a multinational exercise in the Philippines.